Thousands of tons of bombs turned the city into an inferno.
Stalingrad had to be annihilated because there were so many factories producing supplies for the Soviet army. That's why they all had to be wiped out. Every time we were given the command to target a different factory.
Residential areas are destroyed too. "40,000 people die in Stalingrad during the first week of bombing.
A huge black cloud of smoke hung over Stalingrad, and the thermal pressure weighed down on it, so that the cloud of smoke formed an enormous cross. At the time, we saw it as virtually a tombstone for Stalingrad. No one had an inkling yet that it would be the tombstone of the Sixth Army.
Only now are the people allowed to leave the city.
Everything collapsed before our eyes. I lived on the bank of the Volga, about a kilometer from the city center. For the most part, the city was being bombed, and when the first explosion came, I realized, this is it. There is no turning back. A terrible new time awaits us.
Day after day, the German bombers strike. The city soon looks like a heap of rubble. The entry in a Stalingrad girl's diary reads as follows.
September the 4th. They've been bombing us for 2 weeks, even though there's almost nothing left to bomb. Will we survive all this? I'm scared. They're building barricades everywhere. Apparently, the real nightmare is still to come.
German soldiers march into Stalingrad on the 13th of September. Many citizens are surprised by their first contact with the attackers.
I saw some handsome men marching there. They looked like Olympic athletes. They carried themselves upright and had no devilish horns as the children and even we had imagined. They looked good and were quite friendly, really.
The troops are there to break down the last resistance, and they believe the job is done. But the real battle of Stalingrad is only beginning now.
Fighting in the buildings in Stalingrad itself was new to us. That's why there were so many losses, because we lacked experience.
This is warfare in a wilderness of rubble and devastation. The enemy is invisible and everywhere.
It's a fight for a house, where death lurks behind every corner. You can't imagine a situation more frightening and more horrible than that.
A German general writes to a friend.
Attacks coming from cellars, from hidden bunkers and ruins lead to heavy losses among our troops.
He runs across the battle zone with shots ringing out and with ricocheting bullets and so on. I yelled, "Schappel, get down, quickly! Schappel, hurry! They're firing!" Suddenly, he goes down into a bomb crater. He'd been shot in the back. It had ripped open his left shoulder, and where the bullet exited on the right, everything was torn open. The air from his lungs was blowing out there. He said, "Well, Helmut, the war's over now." And I said, Yes, Chappell, the war is over. I promise I'll fetch you tonight. I promise. Lie here quietly and I'll send the first aid people to you. You're very seriously wounded. Can you hear the air from your lungs? Yes, he said.
The first aid workers arrive too late. Regiments turn into units of shock troops. They call it the War of Rats. One wrong move can be fatal.
When fighting in the buildings, we came across all sorts of things. Where Russians were sitting in the cellar, our men were on the first and the second floor. But then there were Russians on the top floor again. Oh, we often saw that in the remaining solid buildings.
Every building became a fortress in the devastated city. Tanks and artillery can play no part in the battle among the rubble. Buildings are taken with machine guns and hand grenades.
The stronger ones among us could throw the grenades 10 to 15 meters up into the buildings. They exploded. Then the Germans opened fire, and their aim was pretty good.
Regardless of losses, Red Army soldiers were forced to attack.
Our company commander, Babachkov, gave the order. Look carefully at the rooms on the first floor, right in the middle. Try driving them out with grenades first. If they jump out of the windows, we'll kill them down here. But they were stubborn. They carried on shooting. Then another grenade, and yet another. Eventually, only one German was still firing and wouldn't let us in. The daredevils turned up. They crept up close to the building and we saw them charge it from the courtyard. Then it was quiet. It was our turn. We didn't take prisoners in cases like this. There was no hands up. But the German fired and was paid back in the same way.
This is the most brutal form of war. In hand-to-hand combat, man against man, the battle becomes a massacre. This is how they fought in previous centuries, steel on steel.
When the Russians suddenly jumped into our trenches, there was only one thing to do: grab a spade and hit in such a way that you struck right here, below the head, cutting the artery and put them out of action.
In this war, no weapons are barred, even the flamethrower. There was growing despair on the Russian side too.
These will be the last words I write you. You'll never see me again. We're parting forever. Somehow I've become indifferent, and I'm not really afraid to die. Sorry if I'm causing you pain. If only I could see you one more time.
Newcomers to the front cannot cope with the hell of Stalingrad.
After 2 or 3 days, I noticed that these young men were no match for what was happening. They came back, and they were mentally disturbed. They laid down their arms. They had cracked up. They spoke mindlessly. To put it mildly, they'd gone mad.
The pictures on the weekly newsreel show a different war. Young soldiers, well cared for during a ceasefire. Reality is different. They are badly neglected and absolutely exhausted.
The longer you're out there as a soldier, the more deadened you become. You switch off. What do you do if the man next to you in the trench gets a direct hit, possibly a grenade, and where the man had been, not a shred is left. The grenade or the artillery missile might have exploded in his body, and then only shreds fly about. That is war. That's what war looks like, and that's the truth.
Dear ones, at last I've arrived at Europe's river of fate. You'll be astonished to hear that the city which has been the object of such fierce fighting is still not in our hands. The Russians are still holding out, but not for long. The decision can come any day now. You can count yourself lucky every day that you don't get hurt. By the time you get this letter, the special news flash about Stalingrad's fall will have come through. How simple a piece of news like that sounds in the peace and quiet of home. But only those who have experienced something similar will ever know what goes with a report like that. How many victims were sacrificed? How many best friends were lost?
The weekly newsreel is determined to report the fall of Stalingrad.
The southern part of the city is firmly in German hands. Our soldiers are hoisting the swastika above an area that was fiercely fought over.
On the 6th of October 1942, Paulus calls off the attack temporarily. The troops are not prepared for the winter. They are badly neglected and cannot even hold a completely conquered Stalingrad. Hitler orders total appropriation of the city. For him, the battle has long since become a question of prestige.
Because it was Stalin's city, Stalingrad. That was the point, exactly. That the dictator on the other side was saying, "The city bearing my name will not be taken." Then the two dictators get stuck into it and sacrificed endless numbers of people to an end, which is speaking in ideological and military terms. Absurd.
There are immense losses on both sides. Time is blood. That is the motto of the defender. Hitler's chief of the general staff has warned that the front is overstretched, the losses are too high. In the coming winter, catastrophe threatens.
Darauf tobte Hitler
went into a rage and bellowed at Hulda. "How dare you judge what one can expect from soldiers and officers? During the First World War, you sat in your swivel chair in General Staff, and that's where you've been this time. I have experience at the front. I know you can expect soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and officers to be willing to die. It's a matter of honor."
Hitler's helper, Halder, is dismissed. The senseless killing continues. The Red Army loses 2,500 men every day. This footage is shot in a Soviet hospital. The Germans don't let cameras into their hospitals. People suffer equally on both sides.
The men lay there. Many of them couldn't move their hands. So when they were discharged, they weren't able to button up their trousers. They wet their pants. They soiled themselves without even noticing. Amazingly, I didn't smell it, even though it must have stank to high heaven. I'd gotten used to it. But when I walked into the cellar with 2 Red Army soldiers and told them this was a hospital, where there were many sick people, the soldiers reeled from the dreadful stench.
Stalingrad has become a city of horror and terror, a city of rubble and ashes. The entire working-class district and the factories have been burnt to the ground. Terror is still etched on the faces of the people.